Hello everyone, it's Gershon from dekoningtan here, and today I wanted to do something a bit different. I wanted to look at synthesized strings versus sampled strings. Now before we get into this video, for those of us who aren't aware, I'd like to give a brief explanation of what exactly synthesized strings really are versus what sampled strings really are. Alright, so let's break it down. When people tend to think of synthesized strings, I think for most people, at least those who are familiar with cheaper, crappier keyboards, they think of something like this.
We've got a great act going. Robert and Rufus. I play the Casio SK1 and Rufus sings. Problem is, he only sings when he wants to. But with this Casio, I can record a sample of him whenever he's in the mood.
It's that old Casio or Yamaha keyboard that you had in your parents' house, and it just sounds like fake strings. It doesn't sound quite right. Why is that? Actually, the sound, interestingly enough, ended up becoming kind of a sound of its own. There's a whole genre of music, which I've recently gotten quite into, called dungeon synth, that kind of embraces the sound of this fake-sounding string. But I digress. People usually think of that when they think of synthesized strings. And when they think of a real violinist playing, they think of something more like this. You can really hear the difference. It's not that the synthesized string sounds wrong completely, but there's something about it that doesn't make it sound organic or realistic. So you kind of know it's a synth string. So that begs the question, what is modeled synthesis and what is this kind of synthesis that we're hearing when we hear that fake sounding string?
Analog synthesis is basically a electrical voltage is generated at the starting point of the synthesizer. Then an oscillator shapes that voltage to a steady pitch at a given frequency, making a waveform that's going to be processed. Essentially, the oscillator shapes the waveform. So think of it as like the sound generator of the synthesizer. That then becomes a wave shape, such as a sine, square, or a sawtooth, etc. There's many types. After that, that signal goes to a filter, and the filter takes out certain frequencies. And then it goes to an amplifier, which makes the sound louder, and that amplifier has an envelope of attack, decay, sustain, and release, which changes the nuance of the sound and alters it. So that's how analog synthesizers messed with sound to get something that sounds like strings, a guitar, or a piano.
Later on, though, our computers got better, faster, and more space, and that included in keyboard hardware. So they started to add actual samples of recorded instruments. At the beginning, these samples were very small samples, and then they would try to manipulate one or two of those samples to try and replicate it. Again, it didn't sound quite realistic. Better, but not quite there.
Future me just jumping in here to say that the Fairlight CMI was the first synthesizer to do this, to take an actual sample and synth at the same time to get that more realistic sound. This was a huge leap for synthesizers and sampling.
So then, as our hard drives grew bigger and bigger and our computers grew even faster, sampling started happening. And that's what you see a lot of nowadays. A sampler is an electronic or digital instrument that uses the sound recordings or samples of a real instrument, like a piano or a drum or a violin strings. And what it then does is it plays those in its player. So if we're talking about a keyboard, the notes are individually sampled. So if we have a piano, we'll sample every note on the piano, and then we will input that into the computer and say, okay, when we touch C1, you must play the file that is also C1. So you get a real sounding instrument. Sampling sounds way more realistic. There are a few things here and there that sometimes differentiate a sampled instrument from the real thing, but you are essentially listening to the real thing. So we've talked about sampling, and we've talked about general synthesizers, and how they didn't quite sound the same as these real samples. But then how does Friktion work? Because I'm going to show you later, it sounds quite good. They do something called physical modeling synthesis. The way in which they generate the sound is different. The waveform of the sound is generated using a really complex set of mathematical instructions or a mathematical model. I'm not into math, so I'm not going to try and explain that part. It uses a set of equations and algorithms to simulate the physical environment of the instrument or the physical source of the sound. So, for example, the body of the violin is a physical space. So it uses math to calculate what that space sounds like. But then the player striking their bow across the instrument has a specific type of friction, hence the name Friktion. And they use a mathematical model to measure how that bow strikes across and at what pressure. Essentially what it does, by kind of replicating the physics of that sound production in a mathematical form, you are able to create the dimensions and the material, sort of the instrument. And then you can also control the player's interaction with the instrument. So think of it as many different math equations about many different factors put into one synthesizer. So while the old synthesizers was basically altering a waveform, here you're altering many different aspects of this instrument. So I wanted to give Friktion a fair shot against a sample instrument. And so I kind of made some parameters to test these two against each other. And I'm going to let you guys be the judge of what you think sounds more realistic. And at the end, I'll give a little recap of how I feel about it. So here are my parameters. Number one, we have to test solo instrument Friktion versus a solo instrument that's sampled. Why? Because many times when there's many instruments playing at the same time, it can have this effect on you where you feel like the more sounds better. I do, however, want to test doubling the sound. So Friktion has the option to have multiple players. Obviously, it's not actually multiple players. And I will test that across to Spitfire because I have some plugins that have multiple players playing. Number two, we have to try out different expressive modes or techniques from both plugins. So for Friktion, I'll try changing the parameters and seeing how that affects the sound. I'll try to play as expressively as possible. For the other plugin I'm using, which is going to be from Orchestral Tools, it's called Amber, I will also be kind of using the dynamics that they have built in there and trying the best legato sounding patch that I can find. Number three, they both need to have the same reverb plugin. And I'm not going to use this ones inside the programs themselves. Often these plugins will have a little reverb built in that you can use. I'm going to turn those off for both of them, and then I'm going to use an outside reverb so that we're really comparing the two sounds in the same space. Obviously, it's not a physical space. And last but definitely not least, I'm going to be playing the same notes or the same song repeatedly. And I will break it down if there are multiple instruments playing at the same time and let people hear both parts. The reason I'm doing this is this will give us an honest representation of what these two things actually sound like when they're playing the same thing, essentially. The only thing I'm going to mess with is the expression. So, get ready to hear the same thing over and over, because that will give us an honest representation of whether this one sounds better sometimes, or this one sounds better sometimes, or if there's an equalness to it, or if they both sound weird at certain points, or maybe this one sounds good in certain situations and this one sounds good in other situations. All right, let's go for this test and see how it goes. Right, so what we're going to do is we're going to do an A-B comparison of the two tracks. Where I have track 1, which is with Friktion, and track 2, which is with Orchestral Tools, Amber. And we're just going to click back and forth between the two and have a listen, starting with Friktion. Switching. Okay, so what have we heard from that? We've heard that there is a slight difference in how the instruments sound mixed together. That could be me, though. I know for Amber, I noticed that the pizzicato, which is that boom, 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 was a little softer, so I boosted the volume, and maybe that's what resulted in them being a little more dominant. The second piece, the cellos are also a little quieter for Amber. But it could also be that for Orchestral Tools Amber, there was just more of the room that they recorded in happening. So you're having that authentic sound, and then you are also getting a little bit more of a faraway sound, a little bit. That's also possible. What we're going to do now is we're going to compare and contrast the individual parts, just to give a closer look at what Amber sounds like individually, all the instruments that are sampled, and what Friktion sounds like, all the instruments that are modeled. So we're going to do that now. We're going to start with the cellos. I'm just going to solo them, and you can hear them play. So you can see that I messed with the articulation a little bit to get that a little bit more swell that strings have as you go across it. I've also put the variation quite high on the bowing. It's not very high for this one, but it's at 62, so it's a little over 50%. And I added articulation, okay? Besides that, I put a little bit more smear on there because I felt it sounded more organic. I guess that's the best word I can describe. And you can see I turned off the reverb because I only wanted to use Tsar's reverb, and I didn't double it. I'm playing chords, but that's it. Because, well, we'll get into it later, but to me the doubling sounds the most synthy. Next, let's have a look at the pizzicato violins 1. Now, I did 3 different groups of pizzicato violins just to give it a fuller feeling. Pizzicato is often very soft. I wanted it to have a fuller sound, so I gave 3 different ones. We're just going to look at one. What you can see is that there's different types of resonator bodies. There's different violins that they have, that they're modeling after. And then here I went ahead and increased the level of the pluck for this as well as where they're plucking exactly, which is cool that you can control all those parameters. And you can also control how many collisions they have and like whether their fingers are not linear, which I think is really cool. There is pizzicato and there's collegno, and collegno is essentially when you're smacking the bow against the strings, so it's a very different sound. So we're just going to listen to that by itself. So you can hear that it sounds quite natural. It does sound like a violin being plucked, which when I first opened up Friktion, this is what I was kind of impressed by. Okay, we're going to quickly look at the other violins, but I won't play you back all of it because then this video would be way too long. You can see that I changed the resonator body and I changed a few of the settings just ever so slightly to get a slightly different sound from each pizzicato violin. Big guns. It's actually a viola doing the solo. So when we listen to that, so it sounds quite natural. I would say that it sounds very close mic'd to the resonator. It almost sounds like it's picked up by a piezo mic. And that room feeling that you're hearing, that's 100% the reverb that I put in. I'm just going to turn off the reverb for this one so you guys can hear it without it as well. So you can hear that when it sounds dry, it sounds very dry, which most string libraries rarely have that dry of a sound. There are some out there that have that, but it could be said that it's extremely dry sounding. So the reverb does add a little bit more of that warm feeling that you kind of get with strings. Now what's interesting to note for Friktion is that if I open up the task manager, you can actually see how much RAM Friktion is taking when it plays all the parts together. We got OBS here taking some CPU, Reason's taking a bit. When I start to play, you can see the exact amount of RAM and CPU power it's taken through this. All right. Not too bad. Okay, so now we're going to have a look at the second Ave Maria, but this time it's with Orchestral Tools Amber. It's a quite reasonably priced quartet string library. Yes, especially if you can get on discount. But yeah, it's, you have some string libraries where you just get a violin only, or you're paying $100 for that. The solo violins, and then you have some more decently priced ones, like from Spitfire, but they're often a ensemble group, not just the individual strings. For Amber, you get the string quartet, so you get the cello, the viola, and violin 1 and 2. And you can play them as a group or as individual instruments. So, what we're going to do is we're going to look quickly at each part, just like we did for Friktion, and just have a listen by itself and compare those two to each other. The cellos. 1 second. Just get that open one more time. All right, we're gonna have a listen to the cellos. Now next is the pizzicato violins. Here we go. Again, I did 3 different ones. And what I did for the orchestral tools is I did different mic positions. So in Reason we had 3 different resonating sounding violins. For orchestral tools I didn't have that, but I did have the room mic, and then there was 2 close mic positions. So I've done all 3 of those for the different pizzicato sounds. Here we go. Here is pizzicato violin number 2. You hear the slightly different sound. And I will now show you guys the viola's solo legato, the 2 of them. You notice a slight crackle here and there. This is something that happens with sample libraries that they're just more CPU intensive. Now, I don't have an amazing top-end computer, but my computer's not bad. So I just wanted to do a quick look at the task manager when I play all these instruments together. Let's see how much CPU it takes versus Friktion. Coming on the high end here. Okay, so it's interesting to note that there's these differences in CPU intensity, which is something to consider as you're going into this kind of music making. If your computer is less powerful, possibly going for the modeled strings might be better. It takes way less space on your hard drive versus sample libraries, which take a ton of space. So what's the verdict? Well, I'm sorry to say that there is not really one. Both are good, and they're both good in different ways. If you want an easy, out-of-the-box string library, something like Amber might be exactly what you need. There are things that can get complicated when you get Amber. the different mic positions, and there's all these different options of types of playing that you'll have to kind of explore. But in terms of just using it out of the box, it is quite easy to use. The patches, particularly the swells, for example, they just sound very nice, very fast, very easily. And it's a bit of kind of plug and play feeling. But the downside of sample library is they're huge and they really do weigh down on your CPU. And I've done projects where I had so many sample libraries playing at the same time that I would have to bounce tons of my audio to be able to edit and mix properly because there were just too many different instruments all doing things at the same time. Another reason is they do sound like real strings. There are a few string sample libraries I've tried out. Usually they're free ones that just don't sound nice, but the ones that you pay for, they generally sound like really nice strings. And so you kind of know exactly what you're getting and you know what you're going to be doing with it. That being said, Friktion sounds really good, and it really does sound like strings. The difference is there's a little bit of tweaking involved to get the sound to sound completely natural. And if you're unfamiliar with what strings sound like, you could end up making little mistakes that make your strings end up sounding very synthy or fake. But the versatility of Friktion is undeniable. If I buy a strings library, I can mangle those strings with effects if I want. But it's still going to be strings at the core. With Friktion, I have much more versatility of options. I could play a general violin, or I could say, you know what, and it changes the sound. It becomes a sound design project. So if you're into noodling with all these little different knobs and trying to experiment with different sounds, that Friktion might be much better for you than Orchestral Tools Amber. The simple reason being that this allows you to do that. This allows you to change the sound more without giving you the traditional sounds that you might expect out of a strings library. So in summary, which one is the best for you? Well, if you're going for a pre-packaged, straightforward string sound that gives you a string quartet in all the different parts, it's out of the box and easy to play, you should probably go for something like Amber, Orchestral Tools, or something similar to that effect. If you're looking for more of a sound design tool that allows you to do those string sounds, but you also want to try and experiment with different types of sounds and different ways of modeling instruments, maybe ones that do exist or even ones that don't exist, Friktion is a great option for you. If you like this video, please be sure to subscribe and tell me if you want to see more content like this. Do let me know. Peace.